So this morning and throughout the week, we've gotten a lot of different perspectives. I've learned a hell of a lot on CKDU and a number of other things. And I want to thank our speakers this morning for really setting the stage of what I'm going to talk about now, which is my passion and also my area of interest and research in sustainability and engaging businesses. So this is what I do. I work with employers to do assessments, to do programs, and to develop best policies and practices for improving worker health and safety. So there are a couple things you need to know about me. One is I have a business background, and I've married it with public health, which has led to a wonderful joint marriage of what I do now today. The second thing you need to know about me is ever since high school, I've had a crush on this guy. Does anyone know who this guy is? Okay. Okay, no, that's awkward. But this is Yvon Chouinard. And Yvon Chouinard founded Patagonia. And Yvon Chouinard, and I think maybe I started crushing on him earlier in high school because I was at a crossroads of, am I going to become a ski bum or a surf bum? But he actually presented a way where you can do both. You can be professionally and you can be a ski bum and a surf bum all at once. He founded Patagonia with the premise of wanting to do good and developed now a business model that has been passed to various executives and leaders to demonstrate case study, a true successful case study of how you can have a triple bottom line, which means you're really succeeding around people, planet, and profits. And this represents, I think, a movement that started a long, long time ago and has turned into a science that we've focused in on over the last 40 years. But what within our country started in the later part of the 19th century with Andrew Carnegie, who wrote The Gospel of Wealth, this very famous article that said, you know, we as businessmen need to be thinking, we need to be trustees, we need to be giving back and stewards to our community, and not just, and we need to be responsible within our society. Then there was O&D Young, who was the CEO of General Electric for 20 years in the early part of the 20th century. And he was the first person to really say in major corporate America that the employees and the responsibility and outcomes of their business processes were actually more important than their shareholders. And this came to be more formalized by a professor out of the University of Iowa, who was Howard R. Bowen, who wrote Social Responsibilities of the Businessman. And now I think we can apply that to the businesswoman. And he said, you know, and posed the question that has been driving the field of corporate social responsibility, or CSR, for over half a century, which was what responsibilities to society may business people reasonably be expected to assume. So that led me, after business school, to actually co-found a company with my sister, where I got first-hand experience to make a go at working with different business partners across Mexico, Chile, and Uganda, to work with local artisans and experience how difficult at such a micro level it is to develop sustainable supply chains, to work with people who might think they have sustainable practices but aren't the same or consistent with your definition of sustainable practices, and work with communities. And so I wanted to know, if it's so hard to do this with a two-person company, how do companies that have hundreds of thousands of workers be sustainable? And if you look at the definition of corporate social responsibility, it has many different definitions, but the general consensus is that it's a business approach or a business practice that contributes to sustainable development by delivering economic, social, and environmental benefits for all stakeholders. So that's all stakeholders. That's the people they serve. That's the people they answer to on their board, whether it's the jerk in the back who's heading it, or whether it's the farmer or contractor that they're working with on the other end. And so this leads you to ask, well, what does sustainability mean? What does it look like? Thanks to Jonathan, we know that it is not Houston. And that what it is back to this triple bottom line. And that sustainability means that we're going to be, in the broadest sense, looking at ways to assess and encourage best policies and practices around the environment. What are we doing? What's our carbon footprint? Around the economy. So to Jason's point, how are we paying people? What does the local economy look like? What is the trade? What are businesses doing? And how is that shifting? And at the societal level, who's working? What's in place for education? What are the health systems like? And how are they operating? And safety? And what opportunity are we giving? And when you put it into this nice diagram, it looks rather simple, but it's complicated, which is the theme, I think, is complexity in terms of having to define this. So categories of sustainability include, on the environmental side, what is our carbon footprint and what is our responsibility in terms of business practices? On labor and social practices, are we offering fair wages? Are we practicing ethically and morally? And what are we doing for health and safety? With philanthropy, that it bridges into philanthropy. Do we donate to national and local charities if resources are available? And volunteering, which I think is a lost art. Do we and our employees do good deeds without expecting anything in return? So if you look right here at the largest employer where we are today, which is Aspen Ski Co., they're a fantastic example of how a company over the last 30 years has developed a commitment, an environmental commitment, which I think is interesting too, to see how corporate social responsibility actually started looking first and foremost at labor. What was the first core economic contribution of businesses? It was to look at how you're contributing to the basic needs of humans, how you're increasing wealth, how are you increasing political freedom. And then over the last 20 years, we're looking at different ways to actually define the contribution of business, because we have NGOs that are posing and challenging businesses to think more ethically. We have social investing. So we're now looking at ways that you could be responsibly investing. And so while CSR has actually was founded with people in focus, now it's actually, to the point that was brought up on the first day, is really elevated the environmental focus. And what I want to do today is look at ways that we can actually bring the second P, the little p, which is the people, back up to be level with the planet. So what's the significance? Why do we care about working with businesses? Well, I think it's obvious to most of us, but just to show you the impact and the voice of these companies worldwide. In 2014, large companies generated $57 trillion in consolidated revenue, making up 90% of global GDP. 73% of these companies operate in developed regions now, but it's predicted that 45% of the Fortune global companies will be based in emerging regions in 2025, and that's including India, Brazil, Mexico. A lot of these regions are talking about vulnerable working populations. They employ huge numbers of people, and you know, oftentimes we have a fishered workplace now. They're contracted, they're employed directly, but they employ between 175,000 to 2.2 million each. There are major implications in supply chains, which we know are being hit by climate change already. But there is this call on companies by governments and markets and investors and society at large to be transparent about their sustainability goals, including what they're doing around worker health and safety, and also performance and impacts. The best example, I think, to illustrate this is palm oil production and its serious negative environmental and social impacts that you see across, let's say, most notably in Malaysia, where you have millions of hectares of tropical rainforests that have been destroyed in recent years. So this large-scale deforestation has displaced animals, but it's also displaced people, and it's causes social conflicts with small farmers, and so every step along the way, we're looking at what sort of social and environmental impact this business is having. In terms of the contribution to climate change industry has had over the last 20 years, this is actually from 1997, so it's outdated, but it is looking at both the northern and southern hemisphere and the CO2 emissions from industrial processes. And so we saw this as well earlier in the week too. In the northern hemisphere, you have across North America, Central America, and Europe, and also Asia, obviously, major energy production, industrial processes, and transportation, which are the major major contributors to emissions. But down in the southern hemisphere, as well as in Asia, most of that is due to land use and clear cutting forests for roads, production, farming, etc. So is climate important to business? And Paul brought up, is it important to risk management and risk mitigation? So in terms of the business landscape, there's a ton of models out there that look at what's happening in terms of globalization, what's happening with current and future regulations, as well as public opinions, changing attitudes of shareholders and consumers. Have any of you gone into a retail store recently? And I'm most familiar with this practice in the retail space with working with brands. But you can actually go into Whole Foods and you can buy a hat by a small company based named Crochet Kids. That's just one example. And you can pick up the hang tag and you know how much water they used to make that hat, how much transportation it took to get there, and you can connect with the farmer that actually, or the artisan that actually knit it. So I think there are success stories that we want to be conscious of when we're telling this story. In terms of new technologies, we want to be looking at what sort of competitive advantage something like this could have. So bringing an economist in to develop different financial models around this can answer the real question, which is, what are the financial measures of value, return, and growth that can be connected to these types of sustainability, climate, and health types of goals that we're setting here today? So the risk disc is one resource or model that came out of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions that was published about 8 years ago. And interestingly enough, it looks at, what do you do for risk? Do you manage it? Do you transfer it? Do you avoid it? Do you accept it? And what is this business preparedness model for climate change? And public hat on, I'm looking at, how does this look like the social economic or ecological model for public health? You have the company and the core operations that are happening within. So that's what physical aspects or assets are at risk. And then in the value chain, you have your workforce and changing lifestyles, and you have consumers. And then this broader network is what's happening to disruptions in supply chains, government, customers, access, and as well as the private public electric and water utilities, and other infrastructure implications to this. And I already mentioned, the power of the consumer and the conscious consumer that's happening, and the awareness of how this is driving brands to adopt better practices. So what are the avenues of influence? You have the worker, the environment, and organization. Keep coming back to that. But across all of these, we need to understand what values, attitudes, and knowledge and behavior are shared in each case. And one size doesn't fit all, as you said, Lee, because in each situation, in each research project, in each program we're doing, all of these are different. So the WHO is paying attention to this. They developed a healthy work a framework called a model for action for healthy workplaces. They're looking at holistic approaches to addressing health and safety with a business model in mind. There are reporting and certifications that are used to benchmark, set goals, manage change. They're also, most importantly, meant to convey impact, both positive and negative, so companies can learn from this. But there's lots and lots of them out there right now, and there's not a lot of consistency. They differ between, in terms of historical development, target groups, geographical diffusion, and what emphasis they hold. So the most commonly, though, they're defined as ESG data, environmental, social, and governance. They look at air pollution, water pollution, waste, greenhouse gas emissions, labor, social, and community issues. And the Global Reporting Index currently has 23,000 reports in their database. They have the world largest 250 corporations, and 92% of them have reported. And so I'm interested in looking at this data. In order to look at this data, you need to know, it's not our same statistical software. You need an economist to be able to actually analyze this. But I think it's important, and why I'm interested in digging into this data is because across their 1,400 indicators, there's only 4 that look at occupational health and safety. Another example, as I mentioned, working with retailers and manufacturers in the apparel industry, is the Higg Index. Was developed initially from Nike to look at as brand tools, product tools, and facility tools for benchmarking practices. There's other examples. The program that Lee and I founded 4 years ago called Health Links, which is looking at small businesses. How can we work with local communities? B Corporation now has financial incentives for companies, social companies that are doing good, and LEED certification. Okay, so quickly, I want to finish up. How do we create leaders for informed decision makers as catalysts for change? There are sustainable leadership models. A model that I wanted us to think about is, I mentioned this at our lunch the other day, are models for systems thinking. How can, looking at benefits of the systems thinking approach versus a conventional approach, which looks at motivation, collaboration, what should our focus be, this group's focus be, and why bother, and recognizing that our actions matter and that we need to learn from consequences. So who are the players? Well, we've got Rick Johnson, we've got Hillary Clinton, we've got Elon Musk, and hopefully his face might go over this face and a little subliminal messaging incorporated over there. And we have major social campaigns that are going on globally. I'm glad you brought that up too, Jason, that you look at channels like National Geographic on Instagram, they have 59.6 million followers. This was a post that got on chronic kidney disease, 246,000 likes, 421 comments, but we have major challenges. The research and practice of sustainability and these assessment tools is vast but fragmented. There is this concern of risk mitigation versus best practice and moving from a reactive lens to a proactive priority. And we're realizing that there are certain views of government regulation as job-killing regulations. So the takeaways from this is that CSR and these sustainability models are geared towards addressing complex problems, and they are a tool for big change and impact for business practices, political and economic systems, and stakeholders in society at large. There is a way, I believe, for us to integrate this data into how we're looking at climate and health, and we need to be at the table. So with that, I want to leave you with this quote from Claudia Asensio, who's responsible development at Pantaleon, who says she's trained as a nurse, and she worked in a clinical setting, and now she's in a company doing this type of work. And she told me, businesses have such deep roots in society. As someone trained in health, I realize working through businesses can be an even better way to create impact. It's both the people and the natural resources, planet and people, that we need to protect. And, you know, selfishly, I care about climate change. And there's so many local groups that are doing great things in terms of social movements, like the ski industry, that employs just over 600,000 people, and giving, you know, your local skiers a voice to champion this further. So let's protect our winners and pray for a great winner, and talk more about what role do we want to play. So thank you so much to the planning committee.
Thank you, Lily. We have time for some questions for Lily.
Yeah, Jason.
It's like a common question. One, I think the reason I put Bonsucro Fair Trade up there is their former standards for occupational health were pathetic. They were all, especially in the context of heat stress. But to their credit, and you know, after long conversations, they are now incorporating the recommendations of La Isla and NIOSH, and it's fantastic. But it requires a lot of persistence, because if the metric's not even there, how does it get better?
Right.
It wasn't there for decades, and they're sending auditors to these companies saying, we're totally sustainable. And to your point, labor, which is 2 on your list, and you know, I would say should be interchangeable with environment, wasn't even on the list. And I think this is really a key thing we need to change.
Yeah, and it brings up a good point of, if you go into the Global Reporting Index, their FAQ is 31 pages long. These are, you know, it's very hard to create an assessment tool that will work for all industries, all organizations, and where you have measures that are so detailed, like reporting the water usage by source, or even men and women and workers, and that sort of transparency and how that's viewed, and where that data is going. So I think it's a good point. Yes, Max?
Just a comment on the GRI. It's interesting, in my totally unscientific discussions with corporate and safety and health professionals, even though there's only 4 indicators of the 61 that are safety and health, sustainability is often being given to the safety and health office in the corporation. That's
interesting. And the other thing that most common for these big companies is that the reporting is being contracted to consulting firms. So the way in which it's reported on and who is also not standard or standardized across reporting. Yes, David.
I really liked your slide on the palm oil story, and I was recalling that several of us were at the EPICO meeting in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago, and one of the keynote addresses was by David Kriegel, who was proposing something parallel to the carbon footprint concept, which I think is a powerful concept, which would be a worker injury footprint, which is to map out all the parts of, you know, cradle to grave aspects of how did that worker get injured. It wasn't just, you know, the particular machine, but all the steps that got to that circumstance, both social and mechanical. So I think this kind of thing might begin to provide some more metrics to use in assessing social responsibility.
I can get the slide you gave it to. I was going to talk about it today, but there wasn't time, so I can get it to you, and I think it fits better in your presentation anyway.
Excellent.
But it gives a metric on that.
And let's tie that back into our discussion. That would be great to follow up on.
Yeah.
Beth, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just had a question. You mentioned the ski industry, which obviously has a stake in the climate change world, do you get a sense that there are other industries that are, considering climate change in their long-term planning, and if so, is any of that health related? I realize that's perhaps a difficult question to answer.
Yeah. So I mentioned the manufacturing industry, and they're very in tune with this, mostly because of the labor side of it, but also because of the supply chain side of it. So what happens when you have factories or facilities that are hit by some of these major disasters? Are there ways to reduce your supply chain costs? So anything in manufacturing any business in manufacturing is definitely paying attention to this. But the ski industry is interesting because they have seen direct hits to this. So they can really quantify what happens when you have half the number of skier days, and what happens when you have to install snowmaking machines to compensate for that. So, or build indoor snow globes in Dubai. Thank you. Yes.
So that was really interesting how you brought the business side of things into it and really trying to quantify some of the dollars. A lot of the things you talked about seem to be a top-down approach, like getting corporations involved, and that's certainly really important because there are a lot of the people who are fighting the most against some of these things. But I also think that even if corporations signed up and said, yeah, we're willing to do this, but then suddenly the cost of, your shirt costs more, then you're going to get negative feedback from people at the bottom who are buying that and the workers who are trying to buy it. And so I guess, I don't know if you have any thoughts about bottom-up approaches as well, trying to start a movement where on a large scale, consumers, regular people are saying, we want this, is there a way that you can make this affordable for us so we can buy it?
Yeah, so I actually think that I did try to highlight that because it has very much been attributed to a consumer-driven and social opinions globally, for consumers saying, we know that this is a problem, we want to know where our banana comes from, we want to know that it's certification is now really been criticized because who knows what organic means and who knows what fair trade means. So I think that absolutely it has to start from the bottom up to demand this. But I also think that when you have heads of state making commitments, that it also has to be somewhat of an upstream, top-down to say, how are we going to implement this with something that it actually doesn't hit the consumer hard as a consequence. So I think that's important. Yes.
Marty, I think you're going to have to save that for the panel. We'll let you start it off with your question to Lily. First of all, I want to thank Lily for a really mind-expanding talk on this topic. Thank you. Before